Before the internet, before smartphones, before social media, there was another kind of network, a secret one. It ran through copper wires and rotary dials, connecting strangers in the shadows of the switchboards. This was a world of phone phreakers, spelled with a deliberate PH to signal their rebellious, geeky counterculture, and one of the most prized discoveries was the loop line. Back in the early 1980s, and even as far back as the 1950s, if you were in the know in New York City, you might stumble onto what sounded like magic, a phone number you can dial that didn't lead to anyone in particular, but instead to everyone who dialed it. These were the loop lines, test circuits originally designed by phone companies like Bell System to check the integrity of phone lines. I, for one, lucked out and discovered this secret world. I'm going to talk about the technicalities, and I will speak about some of my experiences on it. They weren't meant for public use, but once the word got out, the underground scene found new life in them. A loop line consisted of two numbers. Dial into one side and you can hear someone, if they were there, who dialed the other. That's it. No dial tones, no operators, just raw, open voice connection. A true analog version of a chat room or party line. Teenagers, tech nerds, night owls, insomniacs, conspiracy theorists, and lonely hearts alike dialed in and talked to whoever picked up. No names, no addresses, just voices in the dark. For many, this was freedom. In a city buzzing with noise, the loop line was a quiet, electric sanctuary. You can meet someone in the Bronx from a payphone in Queens. It didn't cost anything if you were clever. It didn't matter who you were, just what you had to say. But it wasn't just a random chatting. This was the playground of the phreakers. Phreakers were early phone hackers. They discovered flaws in the telephone system and exploited them, not to harm, but to explore. These were curious minds, tech-savvy rebels who figured out how to whistle certain tones like the infamous 2600 hertz to trick the system into granting free calls or admin level access. I understood all of this. I saw it with my own very eyes. They built little blue boxes, like the one a young Steve Jobs helped market, to generate those tones. They knew the telecom infrastructure better than the engineers who built it. As a matter of fact, there was one high-level employee from the phone company that became a phreaker, and I remember him. His name was Steve Number One, but I'll talk about that later. They weren't just pranksters. They were digital age pioneers before the digital age existed. They mapped the phone system the way early pioneers mapped continents. And they didn't just use loop lines. They found other strange phenomena in the system, like the busy signal lines. There were certain numbers that always gave a busy signal. Somehow, through quirks in the switching system, people discovered you can actually speak to others on these busy lines. It defied logic, but it worked. Now here's my experience. When I first found the busy signal, I was actually calling somebody. And I heard a voice, but it wasn't the person I was calling, but there was still a busy signal there. Now, the busy signal was for me to know that the person I was calling was on the phone. So who was this other voice? See, the other voice knew a number to call to actually go to the busy signal. If you can look at it as a physical place. Because when you called someone, it wasn't actually their number that was busy. When they were on the phone busy, you were rerouted to a place that gave you a busy signal tone. And it's there with certain numbers that you can go and fish for people who were calling someone that were routed to that number that was busy. So you were hanging out by the busy signal. A lot of pranksters, a lot of weirdos, a lot of strange people there. The loop line now, the two lines that if you called, now remember some of those numbers in New York, and it was 773 or 774, 7791 or 7792. There were two different numbers. There were thousands of them, but you call one end and there might be somebody on the other side already waiting. Now, the funny part about it is you call for amusement, you'd call different loop lines, and it was heavily infested with gay men. And you can't go there now. You're on one side, they're on the other. You say, hey man, get off of this thing. I want to talk to a girl. And you would hear them saying, I'm not going anywhere. So you just call another number. And you would meet some interesting and intelligent people. It was amazing, right? You would meet some strange people who were conspiracy theorists, religious, I would say freaks who had some way out thoughts about how the world was. You'd meet some strange sex freaks who were into weird fetishes, and they weren't shy about saying what they were into because you didn't know who they were. You couldn't trace their number because they were on the loop line. So it was amusing if you had a few moments, and it can sometimes get to be an addiction, especially when you tell your friends about it and they get on or they come over and you're hanging out watching a boxing match. You call this thing, and there was a lot of phone sex on that thing. There were a lot of women that were on there actually doing that, and this wasn't for profit. This was free because all inhibitions were gone. So it's a very, very interesting thing. You see, it was a mind blower to find this thing out. You'd prank on people. I'm not going to lie. We'd prank on people, not calling them, but going by the busy signal, and they call up and they'd hear the busy signal and you say hello. When you hear a click and if you don't say anything, they're not going to know you're there. If you hear this click, you say hello. You don't know who you're talking to. And they're like, hello, I'm going to be late to work. And I would say, well, listen, you've been doing this too much. You're fired. Don't come back. Now, you don't get fired that way. I would get cussed out. I would get, you'd call people, or you'd have people call and they'd connect with you on this busy signal and they'd have issues. They want to talk to somebody. They didn't know they were calling a stranger. They were calling someone. Well, you start talking to them and they'll give you their number and you talk to them and you actually met somebody. It was crazy. But as a younger, teenager, going into the 80s when I was early 20s, it was a fad. And I got off of it before it actually died. But I've met on the phone a lot of interesting people and a lot of funny situations, a lot of gross people too. People who I think they had some serious mental problems. But there was this one guy, Steve number 1, and he was like the top dog. And he was a phone phreaker who did some things. He had a lot of power. And I know he was making money, probably illegal, but he got fired by the phone company. And he took a lot of the equipment that they had, somehow, some way, surplus, locked away. He had access, and he had this stuff set up in his apartment. And he was doing things. I don't know how he did what he did. And there was a woman who was just as intense. And these are people who existed on the phone. I mean, they're not in the phone. I'd be crazy to say that, but they worked the phone lines. Now, there was another guy who I met in person who had military background experience, and he was a techie. This was back then. I won't say what job it is, but he actually got to Radio Shack, the old Radio Shack. I don't know if they still have in New York, where you have the electronics and things you can build from the ground up. And he got this tone dialer that you would put on your phone. Like, say, for example, back in the old days when you had a answer machine at your house and you wanted to call it and you didn't have a tone dialer. It was maybe a rotary phone. You can't produce tones to check your voicemail. So you'd put this on the mouthpiece and you hit the tones and hit the codes on the phone, on the rotary phone, and it would give you the response to unlock your voicemail on your answering machine, you know, the messages that were there. So by manipulating these tones to emulate the same tones on a phone that they would use on a public phone, I'll tell you this much, what I knew, I'm not going to say I did it, but read between the lines, but this tone dialer, he rigged it to not do tones anymore. He rigged it to emulate the sound of when you dropped a quarter into the public phone in New York City. And if you remember, you know, I don't know about the rest of the country what it sounded like, but I know in New York City back in the day, when you dropped a quarter in, you heard that's not the same exact sound, but that's the sequence. So when you dropped a quarter, that's how the telephone knew, the company knew that you put a quarter in, only from the sound, not the fact that you put 25 cents in. So they came up with this idea that if you can make that noise in the mouthpiece, if you hold this tone dialer, which is a size maybe a little bigger than a credit card, and you hold it there, and this was a rigged situation. They weren't selling these things because you had a switch on it that can go to regular tones and another switch that can go to make that New York telephone, public phone sound. So if you wanted to make a long distance call and they said you need $1.25 or let's just say $1.10 to make this long distance call from one state to another for the first 3 minutes, you'd hit it 5 times to emulate 5 quarters, right? Thank you. You have 15 cents toward overtime. You know, a credit. Or credit, I said overtime, I'm thinking about a job. But that was crazy. So I had one. So I had friends that passed it around. They were on the public phones, calling all over the country. My life, the things I kind of stumbled on. And eventually, a friend of a friend loaned it out to somebody that never came back. I guess that's poetic justice. But that was going on for years. That was going on for years. I can tell you further stories about that. You know, but by the late 80s and into the 90s, phone companies got smarter. They shut down loop lines or secured them. Phreaking became a federal crime, as it should have been. The internet began to rise, and kids moved from the phone to the modem. But for those who were there, it was a golden age. It sure was. It taught a generation how to think about systems. It gave us our first taste of anonymous communication, of virtual presence, of decentralized community. Loop lines were the ancestor of discord. Phreakers were the grandparents of hackers and coders today. And for New Yorkers who remember, it was something more personal, a voice floating in static, reminding you that someone else was out there in the city that never sleeps, riding the electric night just like you. I have friends of mine who had different experiences with it because I was the one to discover it, and they thought I was crazy when I turned them on to it. And we had guys that met women, dated. It was this little secret. It was a bit creepy in a way too, but it was an addiction because you can hear things, and sometimes people who are already on the phone, say for example, they were talking to each other and wanted to do a 3-way conversation and call somebody, and that somebody that they were calling, their phone was busy and looped over to the busy signal. You can get in the conversation with them. And sometimes you'd have whole conversations with that busy signal in the background. Bam, 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 bam. But the more you talk to them, you didn't even hear that anymore. You know, I've had many adventures through that and through other people. And it was a whole entirely different world that most did not know existed. It was really something. And from what I'm hearing, this went back to the 1950s. So could you imagine? So as they say, the freaks come out at night. There was a lot of that there. There are a lot of conservative women who wouldn't dare reveal their innermost thoughts on an erotic level. And these were not professionals. These were regular people. And it was amazing. I'll tell you that. Maybe I'll talk about it more in detail on a more restricted access type of video. Not here on the ones that I'm using now, but maybe on Lancescurv X. But anyway, that's the way it went. And I'll be speaking about some funny stories from those days. I'll add them into my regular videos. And since you kind of know about this thing now, but it was very, very interesting. And, you know, there's sometimes I wish those days would come back. It was a very interesting time, you know, in New York City.